So, you want to save the world with clean energy? Make money doing it? Confused about the economic and technical realities of residential and commercial solar, batteries, heat pumps, EVs? Want the real-world scoop on new energy technologies, not manufacturer hype? Then tune in to the Weekly Energy Show, hosted by Barry Cinnamon. Insights from Barry's 40-plus years in the solar and energy industry will help you understand the future ways we'll generate and consume energy. And now, here's Barry.
Welcome to this week's Energy Show. Now, this week, we'll be discussing my 10 tips to get the best home solar and battery system. Now, backing up before we get to the 10 tips, when you're thinking about a solar and battery storage system, I have two guiding principles. First, make sure you have a good installer. Unfortunately, there's a lot of consumer fraud going around giving the solar industry a bad name, and that's extending over to battery storage. There's sneaky financial offers. There's all kinds of free offers. Basically, if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. If you're getting a really, really low price for basically comparable equipment from a company, got to be watching out for that. Your antenna should go up. And what's probably the most common, as I mentioned, is quick buck artists promoting ridiculously low prices. I see ads on Facebook where, a system that would go for, say, $4 a watt or $20,000, they're selling it for $11,000 and complaining that the companies that are doing it for $20,000 are just ripping people off. And the reality is these lowest cost companies won't be profitable. They may start a project, they'll get the payment, they'll have all the financing documents done, they may never finish or do a terrible job or a rush job or something's not going to work. You should get references from the actual installer in your area that's going to do the work. And sometimes there's companies that just do marketing and sales. And there's companies that do installations. So your marketing and sales guy is going to really give you a great pitch. He's going to sound really sincere and everything's great. But the installer may be pulling up in a white van and they're just banging the job out and they got to do 2 in one day and they're not really going to pay that much attention to the quality of the job. So it's good to know exactly who the installer is and you have references for that installer. Second guiding principle, you should be knowledgeable about the equipment and the way it is installed. Don't just blindly take the advice of an installer, even a qualified one. Just do a bit of research. Find out about the battery, the inverters, the kind of solar panels you're using. All that information is on the internet. It's not perfect, but you'll kind of get a perspective of what's good and what isn't. A good installer will guide you to the right equipment and design, and you should really trust their advice because if they've been in business for a long time, they depend on good references. Okay, let's dive in to my 10 tips for getting the best home solar and battery system. So first, beware of the 4-letter word free. It usually means something sneaky. There's no such thing as free solar or a free battery. It amazes me. I still see these advertised on the internet, on Yahoo ads, on Facebook. It's actually contrary to the California solar regulations to promote free solar because it doesn't exist. There are incentives available, and a lot of these extra rebate incentives for battery systems are generally targeted for low-income homeowners and sometimes low-income homeowners in areas that get frequent blackouts. It's not available to everyone. Believe me, I spent a lot of time working on these incentives and getting them available for everyone, and then utilities kind of clawed them back until they're only available for low-income homeowners. Sometimes homeowners are in a fire zone, which is okay, but you're going to get into a bait-and-switch situation if you fall for one of those free solar or free battery offers, and then it turns out, oh, gee, the incentives aren't available, or sorry, you've got to pay another $5,000 or $10,000. It's no good. Keep in mind, the only real incentive that you can get is the 30% federal tax credit and a few local solar rebates and credits, but they kind of come and go. Okay. Tip number 2, if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. It's too good to be true pricing and too good to be true financing. Here's what you should do. Just like when you buy or when you lease a car and you finance a car, you should ask for the cash price of the system, because when you go to lease a car, I always negotiate based on the cash price, and then you can say, okay, now apply your leasing or your financing terms to that cash price. Because what you're going to find is there are a lot of financing programs for solar that have what's called a dealer fee or a platform fee. So the system may be $20,000. But I've seen these platform fees in excess of 40%. So that $20,000 system ends up costing $28,000. And it's kind of crazy because that's just extra profit for the installer or for the finance company. So just dig into what the cash price is. If they don't want to give you the cash price, so it's one of those tips that things might not be really kosher. You may be able to negotiate on the platform fee if you really have to finance the system, or work with a local credit union. The other thing that I see sometimes are payment escalators. So after, say, 1 year of using the system, or the second year, they may increase the monthly payments, or they may increase the interest rate on you, kind of like a variable rate mortgage. So dig into the details of that financing. Maybe get, competitive financing from a local credit union, because those credit unions have basically really good financing and they're not out to make a big profit on you. Okay. Tip number 3, don't sign on the spot. Take your time. Don't be rushed. If a salesman tries to jam his foot in the door, just ask him politely that you want to close the door. You're really not interested in high pressure sales techniques. I've had salespeople that brought that kind of characteristic to our company and they didn't last more than a day. So you really want to make sure that the salesperson is being honest with you and not pushy. And if you feel like you're being rushed, just say, no, thank you, close that door. And what you should do is you should get, once again, quotes from established local solar and battery companies. Check their local references and check the reviews of the company, not just the sales company. But if they are using another company for the installations, you want to find out who that company is and what kind of work they do based on their references. Okay. Tip number 4, do not trust a quote generated completely online. It's impossible to properly design a battery system without a site visit by a qualified electrician. Now, for just solar on the roof, you can do a pretty good job based on the aerial photos and see what fits, see how many panels fit, see what the setbacks are from the ridge and things like that, see where the inverter is going to go. You could do a pretty good job. But when it comes to the location of the battery, there's a lot of subtleties, and these subtleties are embedded in the recent local codes. There's state building codes, national building codes, and there's also local building codes. And a lot of these local building codes are very restrictive. For example, the locations in which the battery can be installed, they're pretty tightly defined. For example, the batteries in many of the locations we're installing here in Silicon Valley, they can only go outdoors. The batteries have to be 3 feet from egress doors and windows. The batteries can't be closer than 3 feet unless there's a special certification for it. And it's very, very difficult to put a battery in a garage because the requirements in most of the areas we're installing, they require a certified fire detection system in the garage or an automatic sprinkler system. And a lot of older homes and medium homes, they don't have those extra components, and basically that could add another $5,000 to the cost of the system. So you got to look into it. If there's no site visit, you may still get a final price, but if you read the fine print of the contract somewhere, I guarantee there's something in there that says we'll have to do a change order if the design that we recommended isn't exactly right. So that price increase is almost inevitable if somebody just says, hey, I can put in a solar and a battery system without ever going to your house. Really, really tricky to do. Okay. Tip number 5, beware of free maintenance and cleaning commitments. Now, it sounds like a great idea, but the reality is that this free maintenance and free cleaning, it costs money. Qualified crews that are good at this, that are going to follow the right regulations, that are going to take care, they're not going to clean your system for $50. It's going to be more like $400 or $500 in order to do a good job. The other thing that I've noticed historically, 25 years in the solar industry, is the longer the system warranty that the installer offers, the flakier the company and the more likelihood that they're going to go out of business fast. It's just like an inverse relationship. I've seen companies that have 100-year warranties, lifetime warranties, 50-year warranties on the installation. It's a lot of baloney. The warranties that are required are 25 years, and that's a performance warranty of the module. And that's pretty accurate. But when I look at historically what's working, the solar modules keep working for, say, 25 years. Their efficiency may go down. The batteries usually only operate or good for 10 to 15 years, and the inverters kind of vary depending on whether it's a microinverter or a string inverter, but nothing's going to last for free. So here's a couple things that you're going to have to do. The rooftop system, the solar panels on the roof, they're going to require an occasional cleaning unless you live in an area where you get constant, regular heavy rain. We typically recommend that customers have their systems professionally cleaned every 2 or 3 years when they get really dirty, and I just had mine done this year. And it makes a big difference in the improvement of the efficiency. But then you got to remember, dust and dirt and the debris is going to accumulate, and The day after the cleaners leave, you're going to start noticing a fine layer of dust on those panels. But that's just normal. If you get a lot of rain, it's going to wash most of that off. But the reality is the really heavy grime, the baked on dirt, it needs to be professionally cleaned. Now, the other thing that you may learn is that the warranties on the equipment, they may not be comprehensive. In other words, they may not include the full labor cost of doing the work. And it's a lot of work for an installer to kind of take off a solar panel and diagnose it, or go out and see what's wrong with an inverter, diagnose it, and then make another trip back once the equipment is sent to them to replace. So a lot of solar companies like ours, we actually have to charge for this labor because the manufacturers used to pay for it and now they're not anymore, and we just can't be underwater. So we try and do the best job we can. Once again, if the company that did your installation used subcontractors, that like generic white van, and they just pull up and a bunch of guys just get to work really fast and they're done by lunch, they may not be the same companies that are going to be around to provide the maintenance. They've kind of moved on and they just like to do wrench work, and they're not going to get slowed down with maintenance work that's pretty expensive. Okay, tip number 6, beware of optimistic system savings. Here's the reality. In California now, with net metering 3, it's very difficult to get to a negative electric bill. You can get to a zero bill, kind of tricky. You have to have a lot of panels, but it used to be that you can get to a negative electric bill. Can't do that anymore. The tricky thing about the system savings estimates is that there's a lot of assumptions made in coming up with those estimates. And the salesperson can maybe fudge the numbers a little bit and put in optimistic assumptions. In other words, they may not disclose that the solar panels are put on the north roof. They may say that everything's on the south roof. They may not, obviously if it's on the south roof, you're going to get more output. They may not point out that there's shading from trees, and the trees can actually have pretty significant. There's a lot of systems that I've seen where they've got this evergreen or magnolia tree right in front of the house, directly shading solar panels that are on the south roof. So yes, they're on the south side, but those solar panels are going to get a fraction of the sunlight and generate a fraction of the output that you get if the analysis was done properly. So when you do these savings estimates, your installer should work with some software that downloads a recent set of electric bills, ideally a year's worth of bills, and then use realistic assumptions. Realistic assumptions about things like the electricity inflation rate, realistic assumptions about the amount of sun, about shading, about orientation, and everything else like that. And if all the numbers are realistic, you're going to come up with a pretty darn accurate kilowatt hour savings estimate. And that's what we do. And we're pretty accurate most of the times. And then the only place where it's a little tricky, it's as impossible to determine really what the future electric rates are and the way in which the electric rates are calculated, time of use rates, and things like that. But if your installer is using one of the established solar design tools, which I strongly recommend, and they're using the right assumptions, it's fair. You can ask the installer, whoever's selling you the system, ask them what assumptions they use. They should be able to tell you. If they don't know, then I'd kind of be a little bit worried. Okay, tip number 7, and now we're going to start talking more specifically about the equipment and the way it's installed. Tip number 7, research the company that manufactures the solar panels that you're going to get installed. You're going to want to find out if the company is financially stable. One way to tell is look in the Bloomberg top tier list, and Bloomberg publishes this list. It's pretty easy to find online, top tier solar panels. The company should be, somewhere in that list, maybe the top 10 or 20. It's going to tell you that they've been around for a while, that they're a big company, they have quality reputation. It's not perfect, but, most solar panels that are manufactured from really big global companies, maybe they're headquartered in Korea, maybe they're headquartered in China, maybe they're headquartered in Vietnam, they're going to be pretty good because these are the bigger companies and they're more likely to back up their warranties. If you buy solar panels made by a company that's relatively new or struggling or it just doesn't have really good balance sheet, and if they have some problems with their panels or for whatever reason they're not able to really stay in business, the warranty that you have on that panel is going to be worthless. So I recommend finding a relatively big company from which you're going to be buying the solar panels. It's terrible. Even a company like SunPower, which was like the quality leader, they never really got to be in the top tier of the biggest manufacturers. And, when situations change here in the U.S., particularly in California, when net metering changed and when the financing changed, they unfortunately went bankrupt. So it could happen to just about anybody, but the best way to tell is to find a company that's financially stable. Okay, tip number 8. Research the company that manufactures the battery system that you install. I wrote the word system in caps. Buying a battery system, it's not just a battery. It includes the battery, the enclosures, the inverter, the gateway or the transfer switch, and a lot of software. It's hard to integrate all these things together. It's not like we hoped with a PC or a computer where you buy the PC and you might plug in an external hard drive that's got some standard in it. And you might just use any printer and then any monitor will plug in. Those standards don't exist in battery backup systems. So you want to find something that's been engineered together that has all of the software to make all these components work seamlessly together. You want to find a product that's been on the market for a few years with a lot of references. Watch out for battery system companies that are kind of buying a battery from this company and a closer from that company and an inverter from another company. They may not tell you that, but you can kind of dig into it. If they don't have really deep pockets to properly serve the market, I've seen this happen again and again and again. Companies come out with pretty good products, but they never really got the software working properly, and they never really hit the high volume sales numbers that they needed in order to get the prices down in order to be competitive. So that's what you got to watch out with battery systems. I'm going to go into the details of the major companies, but you can kind of look up and see, who are the top 5 or 6 biggest battery system manufacturers for homes and businesses, and you're going to get a pretty good idea what to use. So I very strongly suggest that you buy a battery system from a company that makes the major components themselves, the inverter, the controls, the software. They put it in a box. The battery cells themselves are somewhat of a commodity. You can get them from some of the biggest companies like CATL, but you want to find somebody that really integrates all the components, because the integration requires a lot of software. And if they didn't make some of that hardware, it's going to be hard to integrate it. Okay, tip number 9. Yeah, you should understand your backup power strategy. And there's really 2 backup strategies that people use at home. One is called whole home backup, which means when there's a blackout, the whole house is backed up. You don't have to worry about anything. And the other strategy is what's called backing up only the essential loads. So here's the dilemma. If you're backing up the whole house, you're going to need more kilowatt hours, more energy in the battery, probably 2 or 3 batteries, because everything's going to be running during the blackout. And you're also going to have to be careful about the power draws of all this equipment, because these battery systems, each battery system usually has a limitation on the amount of amps that battery can put out. And if you're trying to start your air conditioner at the same time you got your EV charger running and somebody turns on the electric oven, it's going to overload the system. It's going to shut off. Overload in terms of it can't deliver that power. So if you have just one battery, you can still do home backup, but you're going to have to watch very carefully the loads that you're connecting to, the appliances that are being backed up, and the battery state of charge during a blackout. So you may see, okay, well, everything's running, but boy, I can only run my system for an hour because the air conditioner is drawing 5,000 watts and, my wife is going to cook dinner. So you got to be careful about that. Now, what you can do with these whole home backup systems is add what's called a load shedding capability. That's a little bit more complicated, but load shedding basically means when the blackout hits, it automatically sheds the problematic big loads like the air conditioner and the EV charger and the pool pumps. And that way you can turn those back on if you want, if you have enough power, but it's not as likely to deplete the battery or overload the battery during a blackout. So that's one strategy, whole home backup. It's the ideal, it's the gold standard, it's the holy grail, but it's tricky to do, and it usually requires at least 2 batteries. The second option, which is you're only going to back up the essential loads. That means during a blackout, only things like your essential loads, the fridge, the internet, the lights, for me, the coffee maker, the microwave, things like that, so that you can life can go on. Your family won't freak out because they have internet, and if the ice cream in the fridge is going to stay cold, and you'll have some lights, and you make that coffee to get out of the house in the morning. But it's a little bit more complicated, because in order to do an essential loads backup, you're going to need to move those essential loads onto a separate subpanel, separate electrical box. And then only the things on that box are going to be backed up. This is what I have on my house. It's worked great. Whether the power goes out in the middle of the day when we're home, or it goes out during dinner when we're just about to sit down, or if the power goes out in the middle of the night, we don't even know. We're not really worried about draining the battery, because we're not drawing that much power. We're only drawing these essential loads, maybe 300 or 400 watts. Maybe if we turn on the coffee maker, it's 1,000 for 10 minutes, but it works out really well. Okay, last one. Tip number 10. Do your own research on the applicable incentives, credits, and financing options. The only incentive that's available throughout the whole country is the 30% solar and battery tax credit. That's great. Total cost of the system, if it's $20,000, you reduce your tax liability by 30% of $20,000 or $6,000. Really simple, works great. Accountants figured it out. It's one page on the IRS form. It's great. Now, there are also local tax credits and state incentives and lots of local credits and rebates and things like that. Often these local incentives have waiting lists and income limitations. As I mentioned, California has the SGIP program, Self-Generation Incentive Program. It's pretty much been restricted down to just being good for low-income customers, and there's some money there. But if you're not a low-income customer, you're going to see these ads on Facebook or YouTube, and it's going to say free battery from PG&E or whatever. They're going to look at that SGIP program, but the reality is if you're not really low income, and often if you're not in a high fire zone area where there's a lot of blackouts, you're going to get that system installed, and it's going to turn out, gee, you didn't really get that $5,000 rebate that your installer said you would get. So be careful. Do your own research on it. Don't get trapped into buying a system and then finding out later after it's installed and you paid the bills that promised incentives not available. Okay, so just to wrap up, I kind of look at this goal of finding a really good system. The first thing you should do, the best thing you should do is find a local installer that's been in business for many years. They depend on referrals, and they're most likely to install a quality system with good equipment. They're also more likely to be honest about the savings because they don't want bad reviews, and they're going to be very familiar with the local incentive availability. They're not going to promote something that's going to turn out not to be true. And they'll also understand, they'll be more receptive. You're not dealing with a company that's 500 miles away. All right. That's all the time we have on this week's Energy Show. Thanks to all of our listeners for tuning in. And if you missed any of today's show, you can always go to the Energy Show website at energyshow.biz and listen to the podcasts.